Hello everyone, my name is John Hermans, and thanks for tuning in to Trivia Media, where I dig into the hidden knowledge and history that humanity can use to empower ourselves against those wishing to control and enslave us. And today I want to dive into the true identity of the Israelites. Have we been told the full story about this group that the three Abrahamic religions stem from? In particular, we're going to be asking some questions about the true nature of the biblical Exodus, and try to track it down in the historical and archaeological records. I'm basing much of my research on the work of Ralph Ellis, though he isn't the only one who's gone down this line of reasoning when it comes to the Exodus, but he is the cutting edge on this topic in my opinion. Most of the time with this debate, with few exceptions, we have the people who take the literal interpretations of the Bible, or we have the people who look at it as a complete myth with no historical basis. This is because the tradition has been that the Exodus took place around the year 1250 BC, where there is no such evidence for such an event. We'll get into why they chose this date later. So is there any historical evidence for the Exodus? Could the Hyksos pharaohs, also known as the Shepherd Kings, hold the key to understanding the true events behind the Exodus narrative? What is the explanation for the plagues of the Exodus? Can we see these in the historical record? What are the origins of monotheism, and how is it different but also similar to the narrative we've been told? And where is the biblical Mount Sinai? The truth may surprise you. Let's dig in. Most of us are familiar with the Exodus story in the Hebrew Bible. Moses, slavery, the plagues, the splitting of the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, wandering in the desert for 40 years, and finally coming to Canaan, destroying the city of Jericho, and founding the city of Jerusalem. However, the only source for any of this is in the Torah, and no evidence has been found to corroborate the story at the traditional date that the Exodus was said to have occurred, around 1250 BC. So does this mean none of it happened and it's all a myth? Interestingly, something that theologians and historians rarely mention is that there was a significant exodus from Egypt to Canaan documented in the historical record. This exodus has many similarities to the biblical Exodus, but also some key differences that might show why the connection has been obscured for so long. The Exodus we're referring to is the Exodus of the Hyksos, also known as the Shepherd Kings. Here we already have a similarity, as the Hebrews were also called shepherds. In his first century work, Against Apion, Josephus Flavius mentions the Egyptian historian Manetho, who lived around 300 BC and whose writings are now lost to history. In Manetho's writings, according to Josephus, he asserts that the Hyksos are indeed the ancestors to the Hebrews. The Hyksos were originally Asiatic foreign rulers who came to Egypt around 2000 BC and eventually became the rulers of northern or lower Egypt. This is a little confusing because lower actually refers to the northern Nile Delta region of Egypt, while the upper region of Egypt refers to the southern Theban Egyptians. The Hyksos people effectively became Egyptians in their culture and venerated Egyptian gods. The god that they most venerated was the Egyptian god Seth, or the Hebrew equivalent of El Shaddai, Yahweh, Adon, or Aten, as we will get into later. Most of these gods were known as the Destroyer, Storm God, or God of War. One could even say they were the adversarial force of nature, or Satan. We can look at the modern-day Temple of Set, or Seth, that was founded by the open Satanist Colonel Michael Aquino, who was head of the Army Psychological Warfare Division for a while. That's another story though. The big takeaway is that the Hyksos were not yet monotheists, but they did favor Seth as their primary deity, rather than Osiris, the fertility and resurrection god, and the primary god of Egypt. The Hyksos priests were said to have hair ringlets, they wore earrings, and they were also circumcised. Although the Jews currently don't wear earrings, in the past they did. They were said to bury their earrings after they used them to make the golden calf. The Hyksos had similar names to the Hebrews as well. One of their pharaohs was even called Jacob, just like the patriarch in the Torah. The Hyksos ruled northern Egypt for a few centuries, until a natural event started to cause a stir between them and the native Egyptians. This incident was the eruption of a volcano on Thera, or Santorini, an island in the Mediterranean. This was around 1600 BC, and it was the largest eruption in recorded history, and it destroyed the island of Thera. Is this where we get the stories of the biblical plagues? I think there's strong evidence to say yes it is. In Exodus 9:8 it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Take handfuls of soot from a furnace, and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of the Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land. This is the perfect description of ashfall from a volcano. Volcanic dust can cause micro cuts and rashes on the skin, and can lead to infection if not treated correctly. The Bible also mentions that Egypt was covered by 3 days of darkness. This is an obvious reference to a volcanic winter caused by the ash in the air that was blocking out the sun. It talks of a pillar of smoke and fire that led the Israelis out of Egypt. If this was a reference to the pillar of smoke left by the volcano, it wouldn't have been able to be seen from Egypt, but word of its existence would eventually reach Egypt from sailors in the Mediterranean. Now let's look at the splitting of the Red Sea. Ralph and many other scholars think this is a mistranslation of the word Yam-Suf, which actually was referring to the Reed Sea, which would have been up on the Mediterranean coast. This actually makes more sense because the Hyksos were based in the northern Nile Delta region, and crossing the Red Sea to go to Canaan would not have been on their natural route of travel. Could this incident be a reference to the tsunami created by the volcano? Because there definitely would have been one considering the size of the blast. First, the waters would have receded, leaving dry land where the water once would have been. Then, after a while, the water would have returned in the form of a massive wall of water, destroying anything in its path. So theoretically, if an army was navigating this event and ventured out into the area of dry land, they could have been destroyed by the incoming tsunami if they outstayed their welcome. So was this chaotic time the catalyst that resulted in the expulsion of the Hyksos? After all, these people were a small minority, ruling over an Egyptian majority. These events might have been blamed on the Hyksos pharaohs by an Egyptian population. Think of them being like the British Raj ruling over India. Either way, there seems to have been a long civil war between the Theban Egyptians and the Hyksos pharaohs after the eruption that ended in the Hyksos leaving Egypt. According to the Bible, it says that the Hebrews plundered the wealth of the Egyptians. Well, this makes much more sense when we realize that this was a powerful army leaving Egypt, not subjugated slaves. Did they also massacre Egypt's firstborn sons before they left, and as they plundered Egypt of its wealth? I think this is highly probable. According to the secular Antiquity of the Jews, written by Josephus Flavius in the 1st century, Moses was the chief army commander of the Egyptian army. At one point, he was sent down to Nubia to destroy the Nubian army, where he then married the Nubian queen. Note that Josephus had access to a much older Torah than we do today, dating back to 600 BC, which was stored in the Temple of Jerusalem that was destroyed in 70 AD. We will get more in the historicity of Moses in a minute. Now, the reason theologians say that the Exodus took place in the era of 1250 BC is because they took off from the city of Pi-Ramses. So they say it must be in the age of Ramses then. What they are missing though is that Pi-Ramses is the same city as the Hyksos capital of Avaris, which was renamed to Pi-Ramses in the reign of Ramses II. Ramses II was known as the Great Chiseler because he would rename everything after himself. The Hyksos people left the city of Avaris around 1580 to 1570 BC in the reign of Pharaoh Ahmose I. And according to the historian Manetho, writing around 300 BC, they went to Canaan and established the city of Jerusalem. Pretty familiar story, eh? There's also evidence that the Hyksos might have destroyed the city of Jericho, as archaeological evidence shows that it was destroyed in 1550 BC, not too long after the Hyksos exodus. One issue that theologians have consistently struggled with is that by the time they placed the exodus in the year 1250 BC, Jericho had already been destroyed for more than 300 years. One interesting side note is that Ralph theorizes that the Hyksos might have spread to more places than just Canaan, and might have gone to the Greek islands as well. For instance, we know that the Spartan elite were a foreign people who came from somewhere else and enslaved the native population. In the first book of the Maccabees, it mentions a letter supposedly sent by King Arius, king of the Spartans, to Onius, the high priest of the Jews. This book claims the Spartans and Jews are brothers, and claims a common ancestry, and are both descended from Abraham. Another connection to this exodus is the Bronze Age collapse, taking place around the year 1200 BC. The biggest factor historians point to in this collapse is the invasion of the mysterious sea peoples. So who were these people? Ralph points to the diaspora Hyksos as a possible candidate, as they would have had a network that could gather people from different areas to wage an attack on their old enemy from 300 years prior, the Egyptians. Let's get back to the story though. There is one more Exodus story in the historical record that does have some relevance to this story, and might even give us some information on the historical Moses, and that is the Exodus of Akhenaten and his followers. In the mid-1300s BC, we get the character of Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti that take the Egyptian world by storm. Egypt had always been a polytheistic nation, though some would hold different gods higher in status than others. No one had ever denied all gods but one, at least not on a large scale. Well, that is where Akhenaten earned his place in history. While his father was still pharaoh, he allowed Akhenaten to build his own city from scratch, and allowed him and his followers to move there. This city is known as Amarna, and this is where Akhenaten set up his new cult of the sun disk, or the Aten. There's some speculation of why Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep II, would allow him to do this, as it was right in the middle of Egypt and it would cause quite a political stir. We get some clues from Manetho coming down from Josephus. In a single passage in Against Apion, Josephus adds quotes from Manetho that are most likely talking about two different periods, in order to fit his narrative. First, he adds a quote where Manetho is obviously talking about the Hyksos. He promised to interpret the Egyptian history out of their sacred writings, and premised this, that our people had come into Egypt, many 10,000s in number, and subdued its inhabitants. And when he had further confessed that, we went out of the country afterwards, and settled in the country which is now called Judea, and there built Jerusalem and its temple. Now thus far he had followed his ancient records. See how he mentions that his people subdued the Egyptians? This isn't the traditional story of the Hebrews, but the story of the Hyksos. Later in the passage, he starts talking about another reminiscent event in history, but conflates it with the Hyksos, or his people, as he puts it. How Amenophis of Paphos told Amenophis that he might see the gods, if he would clear the whole country of lepers, and that of other impure people, that the king was pleased with this injunction, and got together all that had any defects in their bodies out of Egypt, and that their number was 80,000, whom he sent to those quarries, which are on the east side of the Nile, that they might work in them, and might be separated from the rest of the Egyptians. There is some speculation of why Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, would allow him to do this, as it was right in the middle of Egypt, and would cause quite a political stir. Keep in mind here that Amenophis is just a Greek rendering of the name Amenhotep, as in Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father. What this event is referring to is the construction of the city of Amarna. And the lepers here are not physical lepers, but spiritual lepers and outcasts that were in the cult of Akhenaten. These 80,000 people were monotheists who worshipped the Aten, or the sun disk of Akhenaten. This city in the quarry was built from scratch by Akhenaten's followers. Is this the basis of the slave narrative we get from the Hebrews? I think that is a strong possibility. Let's keep going though. He says further that there were some of the learned priests that were polluted with the leprosy, but still this Amenophis, the wise man and the prophet, was afraid that the gods would be angry at him and at the king if there should appear to have been violence offered to them, who also added to this further that certain people would come to the assistance of these polluted wretches, and would conquer Egypt and keep it in their possession for 13 years. So it's always been a bit of a mystery of why Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, allowed Akhenaten to build this city. Well, here we get the answer. It was that he did not want the gods to be angry with him for causing violence on these people, and that he was afraid that a certain group of people would come to Akhenaten's assistance, conquer Egypt, and keep it in their possession for 13 years, which is about the time frame that Akhenaten did actually take complete control of Egypt. Ralph suggests that the people that might come to aid Akhenaten is none other than the descendants of the Hyksos. Let's see what happens next. After those that were sent to work in the quarries had continued in that miserable state for a long while, the king, this would be King Tut, was desired that he would set apart the city of Avaris, which was then left desolate of the shepherds, for their habitation and protection, which desire he granted them. So here we have the toil of the workers in the quarry for years on end to build Akhenaten's city of Amarna. However, after Akhenaten was deposed and his son King Tut took over, or more accurately his advisors, they wanted to get this cult out of the center of Egypt. So these lepers were sent to Avaris in northern Egypt, which was left desolate of the shepherds, or the Hyksos, because we know that Avaris was the old headquarters of the Hyksos, which had been empty for more than 200 years at this point. And keep in mind, there's no evidence that Akhenaten actually died in Amarna, as his body is most likely in Avaris, or even Tunis, as Avaris was dismantled and brought to Tunis later on. Here the passage continues. It was also reported that the priest who ordained their polity and their laws was by birth of Heliopolis, and his name was Osirseth, from Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis, but that when he was gone over to these people, his name was changed, and he was called Moses. Here, according to Ralph, we have the biblical Moses coming into the historical record. So here we have a group of monotheists who were ordained from a priest called Moses, and were led on an exodus from the quarry city of Amarna, which they had built from scratch with great pressure from Akhenaten, and were sent to Avaris, which was once the city of the Hyksos. So what we have in the biblical exodus is a conflation of these two historical exoduses, the exodus of the Hyksos and the exodus of the lepers of Akhenaten, and made into a single narrative that could be used as a cohesive force to keep the Hebrews in a cultural unit. A victim narrative is a good method to achieve this, and other than the slave element, the story isn't all that different. One interesting side note is that Sigmund Freud's last book that he wrote, called Moses and Monotheism, has a similar theory, stating that Moses was a priest and a follower of Akhenaten, and brought monotheism to the Hebrews. Though he differs on some of the details, the theme is definitely similar. Now let's get into my last topic. This is the identity of Mount Sinai and why it has been obscured for all these years. So why haven't we found this elusive mountain yet? After all, it is arguably the most important site in Judaism, where Moses got the 10 Commandments from God. How could it just be lost to history? Well, Ralph's theory is that it never was, and it has been hiding in plain sight this entire time. Let's go over some of the identifiers of this great mountain. It is said to be the biggest mountain in the area. It is also said to be cordoned off with boundaries placed around it. So it was small enough to be cordoned off, but also the largest mountain in the region. So it must come out of the ground in a somewhat sharp manner. This also tells us that it must be near enough to a population to need to be cordoned off. It was said to have a cave inside of it. And lastly, at its base, it was said to have a dark blue pavement that could reflect the night sky. Now, Egypt is mentioned in the Bible over 600 times, but what is oddly not mentioned, not even once, is the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is one of the most technologically and awe-striking achievements to ever be produced by man, yet they fail to even mention it once? This would definitely have to be done on purpose. Joseph was a priest at Heliopolis, which was a stone's throw away from Giza. Did he never visit? Let's look at the Great Pyramid for a minute. It is the largest mountain in the area. It is small enough to be cordoned off. It also has an inside chamber, or a cave. This isn't the king's chamber that is open today, but the lower chambers had been open for millennia, and is mentioned by the Greek philosopher Strabo when he visited in the 1st century BC. Lastly, we have the dark blue pavement that reflected the night sky. Surely this is just a story though, right? Well, oddly enough, on the base of the east side of the Great Pyramid is a black basalt pavement, similar to the description of the Sinai pavement. Here are a couple pictures of it. Also, here's a picture of what basalt would look like when polished. Notice how reflective it is. So why would they hide this fact? Well, one reason is that the Hebrews were trying to separate themselves from the evil Egyptians in their narrative. We also note that the pyramids were not tombs of the pharaohs, as there were no inscriptions found on them. And the last thing a pharaoh would do is get buried in a massive tomb with no inscriptions to show who it belonged to. It is becoming a common belief that the pyramids were built at least 12,000 years ago, based on the orientation with the constellation Orion, but it could even be further than that. Who knows why they were built originally? Maybe they are a type of power generation technology that has been lost to us. But for most of Egyptian history, they would have been used as sacred temples, used to initiate members of the priesthood into its sacred knowledge. What knowledge are we referring to? Well, when we look at the dimensions of the pyramid, what we see is that it is actually a 40 times copy of pi. Pi is represented by 22 over 7, and when we multiply that by 40, we get 880 over 280, the dimensions of the pyramid. And when we multiply that by 2, as in 2 pi r, we get 1760, which is the circumference of the Great Pyramid in royal cubits, and 280 being the height of the Great Pyramid in royal cubits. 1760 is still the amount of yards used in an imperial mile today, so we still use this measurement system based on the pyramids. This knowledge of 40 would have been the knowledge of the initiated members of the priesthood, thus why it is found so many times in the Bible. This is why it is said Moses spent 40 days in Mount Sinai, and why the Israelites spent 40 years wandering in the desert. This knowledge of 40 essentially serves as a Masonic code, signaling to initiated members that they are privy to the esoteric teachings of the mystery school, which includes the secrets of the pyramids and the understanding of geometry and mathematics. Here are additional examples where the number 40 is referenced in the Bible. I think this lays out some solid evidence to the historicity of the biblical Exodus and shows the true identity of the Hebrews as Egyptian rulers. Another aspect I hope to get into in the future is the identity of David and Solomon, which Ralph shows evidence that they weren't actually Israeli rulers, but Egyptian pharaohs, ruling out of Tanis in northern Egypt, which is very close to the old Hyksos city of Avaris. There is no historical or archaeological evidence for their existence in Israel during the time that they supposedly ruled. To the contrary, the evidence shows that Jerusalem was a small village in the era of 1000 BC, not a rich and powerful kingdom. The pharaohs of Tanis, who aren't too far away, are another story though, but that story is for another time. The main theme here is that the Hebrews are more connected to Egypt than we previously thought, and despite the story in Exodus telling us that they were slaves, they were actually powerful rulers. Other than that, the story is pretty much the same. I think this is an important thing to realize in today's world though, as we are being told by Jews and Zionist Christians that the Jews are God's chosen people, and we must send our support in the current war in Gaza. And though the Jewish culture is rich in tradition and esoteric knowledge to teach, the historicity of the Moses story and being the chosen people of the God of the universe is absurd in my opinion, and only creates the supremacist mindset that allows them to justify the war crimes being committed by Israel right now. Well folks, that's going to wrap up my video on the identity of the ancient Hebrews, and if you liked the video, please like and subscribe.